Tonight I'm going to talk about my story, which started when I was a child. And I want you to know, and for the people who have never heard me speak before or heard an alcoholic's story, that I in no way am trying to brag on what I did. I drank a lot, and it's nothing to brag about. But the way it comes out, some people say, why do you even say those things? Because it sounds like you're bragging. Well, I'm not, but you have to get the whole story. And so I try to tell you the whole story. And if you want to mention anything to me afterwards in private, you're more than welcome to. But my story started out when I was quite a small boy. I grew up in a little town of Huntington, Indiana, and it was back in the 60s, and it was I was part of the nuclear family. We had 5 of us in the family. My dad was a newspaper publisher, so he was kind of a big deal in the community that where we were. My mother was a housewife, but she was in every club and every sorority in town. And then my 2 brothers, who were 8 and 10 years older than me, were quite popular in school. And then there was just my twin sister and I, who were the little ones. But we always had people at the house, whether it was my brother's friends or my mother and dad's book clubs or potlucks or whatever else they might have been there for. We were, as what I consider a Christian family, not as Christian as probably some of you here, but there was social drinking going on in our house whenever we had company. People would come over, have a cocktail, have dinner, whatever. And I used to look at my parents and watch all this happen and say, yeah, they're having a pretty good life. They're having fun. And it must be the stuff that they're drinking. And so I would go around after they went into the dining room. I would go around and collect all the glasses and start drinking out of them. And for a 6, 7, or 8-year-old trying to do that was, it burned. It was not good, but I felt like I was part of the crowd, even at that age. So it was kind of an early start for me because I never stopped. You know, that was fun to me. And then I'd go upstairs with my sister and bounce off the walls and act stupid and acted stupid for the next 40 years. So that's the way that kind of went. But there was also some other things going on in my life as a young boy that I would come to find out in recovery years later that was putting pressure on my need to drink. And so I said 6, 7, 8 years old, and I was drinking at every one of my parents' cocktail parties, and every week. That's just what we did. And as the older I grew, the more I saw my parents and of course my teenage brothers sneaking out to have beer parties and things like that. But in 3rd grade, kind of changed my psyche on things. And they all say that, every addict, alcoholic, whatever you have a problem with, the main cause of that is, what do I tell you all the time? It's all shame, based in shame. And my 9th year of my life, 3rd grade, my whole life was based in shame there. And it was things that my mother never even knew about. I'll tell the one story that causes me probably the most pain in my life was when I was in 3rd grade, and I have a twin sister. We were in the same grade, a K through 12 county school out in rural Indiana. And I think there was probably 14 or 15 boys in the class, 14 or 15 girls. It was just about every class was the same. Well, the boys went to the bathroom all as one, and some of the boys began urinating all over the bathroom and thought it was funny, as little boys would. And I don't know if I ever thought it was funny. I tried to get out of there. But at the end of that, some of the little boys told the teacher that I did it. And this teacher was so low, and she brought me up to the front of the class and asked me if I did it, and I said no, and then she accused me of lying. Then she stood me up on a little table, or a chair, I think it was a table, and said, "You want to see a bad boy? This is a bad boy right here." And then she pulled my pants down, my underwear too, and spanked my bare bottom in front of the class. I was mortified as a child. I mean, all my friends sitting out there in the class laughing at this, at what was going on. And my sister was threatened never to tell anybody that, or I don't know what they said that would happen to her, but I never mentioned that to anybody. From that day on, everything in my life that happened bad to me, that I was filled with shame about, I would neatly press farther and farther and farther down into my soul. I mean, I couldn't even think about it. And I was always trying to be a good kid. I mean, my grades weren't always that great, but I was a pretty good kid. I went to church. I was an altar boy. I did, everything I thought was right. But even the year after that, I was in 4th and 5th grade, and the teachers were still playing these same games with me, I think because Mrs. Crosser thought that I should. And then by the time I got out of 3rd grade, Miss Crosser told me never to sing. You ever been told not to sing? As a child, you have a glad heart, and you go to church, and you want to sing the hymns and this and that. She told me that I could not sing and never, ever sing. So that made me feel even worse. And this was about the time in my life, by the time I got to 6th grade, I was now stealing alcohol because I always felt so bad. I didn't feel normal. I didn't feel like I was one of the other guys. So I was starting to steal alcohol from my dad's liquor cabinet. And whenever I went to my grandmother's, I had a friend there, and we used to always go raid his father's liquor cabinet. So when I was in 6th grade, 12 years old about? I was really a full-fledged alcoholic. I had to drink every day. And I couldn't drink much without throwing up, but I drank every day. I mean, it was just part of who I was as a 12-year-old. And my grades in school kept going down. Here comes the shame coming back into my life. And it was getting harder and harder and harder just to be me. And then I found myself lying to my parents about things and trying to offer excuses about why my grades were bad and this and that. So my parents at that point had a great idea, and that was to send me to military school. Well, and it was a good idea. It offered structure in my life. I didn't know anybody, and it was one of those things that I embraced because I was doing poorly in school. I wanted to go to a good college, and I thought, okay, well, I'll go to military school. That was a bad idea because when you find a top-of-the-line military school, you find international students. And what do international students bring to the school? International drugs. So when I got to military school when I was 15, and my roommate, who was from Maracaibo, Venezuela, started giving me marijuana. And this was a great way because I couldn't drink there because the school staff and everybody else would smell it on your breath. So we'd go out to the high school dugouts at night and smoke a joint, and this was great. And no one even knew me there. But as I started taking the classes, which were a lot harder than my public high school classes, I thought, this isn't good. And I was failing. I was failing a lot of subjects. I was having to try to catch up. I was making excuses. I was lying to my parents. And so I was barely getting by in this school, which made me feel even worse than I did. The summers were exciting because I could go home, see some of my old friends. Even though we had moved, I was finding as my friends were growing older, they were drinking too. And, it was just one thing over and over and over. And my parents never even considered that I was doing this. And I was a senior at my military school. I came home and I had a bag of marijuana in a leather bag. And I'd been out the night before with some friends, stuffed this underneath his car seat so he wouldn't find it. Well, what did he do the next morning? He cleaned up his car and pulled out my leather bag full of marijuana. And he says, "What's this?" And I said, "Oh, it's just tobacco, Dad." He says, "Well, I didn't know you smoked a pipe." And I said, "More often than you'd want to know." And he goes, "So this is just pipe tobacco?" And he says, "It doesn't look like regular pipe tobacco. It smells funny." And I said, "Oh, I get it at that place out at the mall." And I was so convincing, he never even thought twice that this might be pot. And so years later, when I told him about what he had done, he about hit me. He was so angry with that. But that's how good, and if any of you are alcoholics or addicts or whatever, you know how good of a liar you can be. You can be very convincing to even the closest people in your life, what happens then? It makes you feel even worse, more and more of the shame and this and that. So my shame was building hand over fist throughout all my school years. And then I went off to college. I went to Michigan, to a little college in Michigan. Why?
Because of the drinking age.
The drinking age back in 1974 was 18 years old for anything I wanted. It's the only reason I went to that college was so I could drink in Michigan. And that was not a good thing for me. But I became the president of my fraternity house, responsible, what have you, planning great parties for rush parties. And in 1974, we had a tornado outbreak up in Michigan and Ohio and Indiana. And we decided, or I guess I decided, it'd be fun to watch the tornadoes go by from the roof of our fraternity house. And we never saw one, or we thought we might have, but we did get the keg of beer up there to help us out until we lost control of the keg of beer and it started to slide off the roof, and I went with it. I wasn't going to let that thing crash. If I had to get hurt from that was my deal. Anyway, I did get hurt. And I think my wife kind of thinks that's one of the dumbest things I've ever done. But anyway, I knew that my life was in trouble even at that point. I knew that I wasn't getting anywhere. And by the time I was a senior in college, my grades were horrible. I was done with sitting in a classroom. I blew off most of my classes, opting to go skiing up in northern Michigan in the wintertime and smoking pot and drinking and having fun like I was supposed to do in college. I didn't know this was supposed to prepare me for the rest of my life, but it did. And so I made the smart decision to quit college one semester early. How do you think my parents felt about that, since they were the ones paying the bills? I quit college 16 hours early. And both my parents were just so upset with me and disappointed. And that's the one thing I never wanted to do to my parents, was disappoint them. Because another part of my shame project was I was an adopted child along with my sister. And adoptees do not want to disappoint anybody. And I did. And so I lived really the rest of their lives knowing how I disappointed them. And but when I left college, I thought, okay, I'm going to get a clean start. I'm going to go out to Arizona to where my family was living. And I'm going to leave the alcohol at home, the drugs at home. And that didn't work out that way. And I went to work as an EMT on a small town volunteer ambulance service with great anticipation of becoming a paid paramedic someday with a big city fire department, which I eventually did in Phoenix. And but you know what firemen and paramedics do really well when they're off duty? They throw great parties, and I was always part of those parties. So my drinking never went away. It kind of spaced out a little bit in between the times I was doing my shift work, and throughout this whole time, I was always pretty much in control. I was very high functioning. I don't recall ever drinking and being on duty at all. I do remember popping some speed from time to time when we'd get so tired from a shift or whatever, but I was always very high functioning. And so from there, I spent 14 years I was on fire department duty. And it was one of the greatest jobs of my life until I almost got killed in a fire. And after I got out of the hospital, I was unfortunately addicted to the painkillers from the hospital. But that didn't last too long, so I can't blame too much of my addiction on oxycodone or whatever it is that they gave me back. It was probably Darvocet, as long ago as that was. But after I got hurt, I decided I had been thinking about getting out of the business until a new virus came on the scene in the early 80s that threatened all of our lives. Anybody know what that would have been? Say HIV, AIDS? Yeah. It was AIDS. Well, none of us knew anything about AIDS. And we had an accident one night. A very openly gay man was hit by a car and ripped his left arm off, and that's the side of the body I was on. And I got all of his fluids on me and in me and wherever they could land. The next day, we were told we were off duty for the next 6 weeks because we were exposed to this new virus called AIDS, and nobody knew anything about it. We didn't wear gloves, we didn't wear gowns, we didn't wear face masks. We didn't do anything. I mean, I was doing mouth-to-mouth on people that could have had this disease, and I would have never known it. But anyway, so I spent 6 weeks on light duty and trying to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life, because I now had a family with 3 kids, and I was not going to abandon them because of some disease that I have nothing to do with. So I decided at that point that I was going to go on into the career that I had chosen in college, and that was journalism. My family was in journalism, and I was always interested in journalism, every aspect of journalism, writing it and putting the papers together, et cetera. And so the fire chief came to us and said, "You guys are cleared to go." And I said, "Well, here's what I'm cleared for. Here's my resignation, and thank you for all the opportunities." And at that point, my dad had offered me a job on his newspaper. The one problem with this now is now going to be living by myself in this little town in Arizona where there's absolutely nothing to do but ride horses and rope. And if you've ever been out in Arizona around riders and ropers, what do? They drink, and they drink a lot. And so now I was right back on this horrible roller coaster I just couldn't get off. You know, as many times, and for those of you in this room that have had an addiction, you know how hard it is to get off of that merry-go-round. You try, and you can't. And I was, but I was now married and had kids, and I thought, okay, I've got to straighten up. So anyway, now the drugs had gone away, but I was still very full of alcohol. And in college, I was known as one of the better chuggers in the group, and so I would go to contests in bars for chugging, and this is when I'm an adult. I mean, this is what kids do. This is not what adults do. So anyway, my drinking started to interfere with my family. And I would call my wife, I'll be home in 30 minutes. Well, 30 minutes turned into 3 or 4 hours. When I walked through the front door or fell through the front door, the fight ensued. And this was really a daily occurrence. And I I look back, and if there were things that I ever regretted as part of my story, this one was, because my wife Cindy, my late wife Cindy at the time, said, I'm going to leave you and take the kids unless you go get help. Well, that got my attention very quickly. And I thought, okay, I can do a rehab for 30 days. And and at that point, I didn't think I was in that big of trouble, but I was. I was not paying attention to anything I was doing. And so I went to a hospital rehab in Phoenix and stayed there for 30 days. Well, I was the best patient they had. You couldn't have found a better patient. I was just agreeable to everything. And got out after 30 days, and we were one big happy family. I was sober, or at least I wasn't drinking. And but it would take a couple of years to figure out that I was just a dry drunk. I wasn't drinking, but I still had all of this stuff inside of me that kept saying, let's go get a beer, let's go get a beer. Although I didn't really relapse, I had it on my mind. I was still not being honest with people, and which is such a central part of recovery is you've got to be honest with everybody, especially yourself. So that went on. I stayed a dry drunk for 10 years, which I thought was pretty good. But during that time, my wife Cindy had developed leukemia. And I knew from the very first day of that diagnosis that I knew that she was going to die. I just had it in my heart that there was nothing I was going to be able to do to save her. I was not a practicing Christian. I would pray for her, but I was not expecting any kind of a miracle or anything else, and I wasn't ever in church enough to pray for a miracle. So 4 years I researched this disease that she had. All of my research told me it was going to end one way, but I kept taking her places. I took her to Houston, and I took her to Chicago, I took her to New York. I took her everywhere to try to find a doctor who could save her life. And we thought we'd found one in Philadelphia. She had a transplant in Philadelphia, but it only worked for about 10 weeks. And then the leukemia became more and more aggressive. And now this point in my life, my shame and my desire to drink was just really coming on hard on me. And I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do. I mean, and we talked about it. She knew she was going to die. She had that feeling deep down inside of her. We went to Nashville, and she was going to have a chemotherapy to wipe out her entire system, and then after that was going to be done, then she was going to go to Duke University in North Carolina. And I think I was kind of just brain dead during this time. I was with her for 6 weeks for her chemo in Nashville, and I would leave the hospital at night at about midnight and get up early in the morning and go back. Well, my midnights out of that hospital were starting to lead me to drink, and I felt like I can have one. And then I started to meet people in Printer's Alley in Nashville and went out to this bar real late, and I met the most remarkable young lady in there. And she said, well, we're throwing everybody out because my band here is getting ready to rehearse. And I said, I just want to sit here and have a beer. My wife's dying in the hospital down the street. Can I just stay? Well, she felt very sorry for me and allowed me to stay. And I was drinking on their tab. And the young lady was gorgeous. She was just a very friendly person. Her name was Shania Twain. And Shania sat and prayed with me. She was quite the Christian. And she said, what can I do to help? She said, can I come and meet your wife? So she took it out of her day a couple days later to come and meet Cindy. And Cindy couldn't believe it. And I was so afraid when Shania got into the room that she was going to narc me out for drinking. She never said a word about it. She just said, your husband's been in enjoying our music. So I got by that one. But the following, this was in the fall, so the following spring in March, Cindy's bone marrow just took a dive, and she was seconds from dying. And the only way we could get her back up on a stable platform was to get her back to Philadelphia, where her initial bone marrow was extracted and treated and still good. But that night, a horrible ice storm came through Evansville, Indiana, and we were at home by then, and we couldn't get her out. And I had called every charter jet service that I could find. Nobody would leave in this ice. And I called our priest in. We were Episcopalians at that time. She wanted to talk to Father Ray, and so he came down to Evansville where we were, and she literally was on death's doorstep until Father Ray and this woman who was the hospital chaplain, they came in and laid hands on my wife and started praying for her. And I had fallen asleep at her bedside with my hand on her arm, and she woke me up the next morning by hitting my head and said, what are you still doing here? So the prayers worked. It was, other than gave me a headache because she hit me so hard. And so anyway, we still had to get on down we still had to get to Duke. She was over that hump, and we got in the car and we drove down to Raleigh, North Carolina, and she was put into this program of going through yet another transplant, and this time it really did work. And she was cancer-free for 25 days. Wow. And it was really something. She died a couple days later, but it wasn't from cancer. It was from an infection that she had gotten in the hospital with no immune system. Well, what did that give me license to do? I started drinking again. And I didn't just drink a little bit. I was drinking a lot, and I was so mad at God. God was ruining my life. He took the love of my life. He hurt my children. I mean, I was blaming everything on God at this point. And I didn't realize till years later how bad that was. And so anyway, I spent the next 7 years. Well, during this time, I got remarried to a drunk, dated her drunk, asked her to marry me drunk, got married drunk, lived our lives drunk for a few years until that almost put me in the grave. And I was drinking, folks, 2 gallons or at least a gallon of absolute vodka a day on top of a lot of wine. And I would start at 7 in the morning and not quit until all the alcohol was out in my house. And the fights that my wife and I at that point were having were just incredible. They were physical. It was, I don't know if I could make up a term for hell other than my marriage to Gail at that point. And because she was doing the same things I was doing, but she was blaming me for it. So anyway, I had, my children were growing. My 2 sons were in college. My daughter was 15 when her mom died, and she was growing up quickly, but she was growing up without a mom and a dad because I was never at home. I was always out in the bars. I was always having parties at home and this and that. And so it took me some time until the alcohol and the drugs came back at that point, and all affecting my health. So I went into my doctor because I have high blood pressure. I've always had high blood pressure. And my doctor had written on a piece of paper that my diagnosis was acute alcohol abuse. And how dare he say that? How dare he accuse me of that? I was an upstanding citizen in this community. How dare he say that? And so I was out of my mind. I went back into the doctor's office from the parking lot and demanded to see him. Of course, he was seeing other patients. So what did I do? I went through the doctor's office, opening every door. Dr. Patel, you quack, where are you? And I was screaming this out, and probably in not too nice of words. And they called the police. I got out of there before the police could get there, and I didn't go back and see him again for a long time. But anyway, my daughter found that. My wife had found that note and decided that it was time to call my family. So my daughter called my brother, and I think my wife called my mother at that point and said, Mike is dying, and my liver enzymes were off the charts, my triglycerides were off the charts. I was not well, and I was pale, and anyway, it was time for our annual family meeting, and we always went somewhere in California along the coast to have a family meeting, all of the family, and talk about business and our investments and whatever else. Well, they chose this family meeting to have an intervention with me. And I had heard of an intervention with Betty Ford. It was in the papers years before. But so I met my family in my mother's hotel room, and they blocked the doors, and they started telling me that they were worried about me. It couldn't have been done with any more love. Nobody raised a voice except for me. And I could not believe that I was being called out for drinking by a family who drinks. My mother drank wine every evening before dinner. My dad at this point was dead and gone, but he was an alcoholic. My mother always refused to believe that. Both my one brother, Chris, was an alcoholic since he was a teenager and still drank, and my sister was an alcoholic. My other brother drank alcoholically. So here I was calling every one of them a hypocrite. And if you've ever had to confront your family over something like that, it's not very pleasant. And so anyway, I agreed. They said, we want you to go get help. And my brother had chartered a plane for me to go down to Palm Springs to a place called the Betty Ford Center. And some of you know what that is, some of you don't. It's very, very popular and famous hospital. So I went down there and stayed for 30 days, and I was actually sober then. In the first 30 days, I was actually sober for the first time since I was 6.
Wow.
I mean, sober in my mind and spirit. And so, and there they do the AA program, 12 steps. And I had embraced that early on when I was at St. Luke's in Phoenix, and I embraced it again when I went to Betty Ford. But there was something different this time. And I had a spiritual advisor assigned to me, Father Patrick, or Brother Patrick his name was. He was a Benedictine monk who happened to be a recovering alcoholic. And he only had one leg.
Wow.
He passed out on a railroad track one night trying to get back to the monastery. That's a whole different story. I'll let him tell it. But Father Patrick came to me one night and he says, "You're having a hard time here, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, I am having a hard time. I'm having a hard time because they're telling me that I've got to ask God on my third step, that I've got to turn my life and will over to love and care of God." I said, "Patrick, I can't do that. God, whoever he is, has ruined my life. He's taken my wife from me. All my kids hate me, blah, 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 blah." And he says, "I think you're tossing those accusations around a little bit loosely there. It's not God, but you need him." And so anyway, we went through this conversation many times over the next several days, because they were not going to let me get out of the dorm I was in and move up until I accepted the third step in the 12 steps. So I fretted about this. I wandered the halls all night long in my dormitory. I would sleep in the afternoon between our meetings with our counselors. And I finally, one afternoon, it was August, when was that? It was about August 20th. And Palm Springs in August is not a very friendly place. It was 118 degrees out that day, not a cloud in the sky, not a wisp of wind. And there's another hell for you right there. But anyway, I decided, okay, I've got to get this figured out. And I'm just getting very anxious. I'm sweating. I'm pacing around the dorm. So I walk outside, sweat even more. But I paced up and down in front of a little lake we have there called Lake Hope. And I paced up and down and would sit on the bench, paced up and down, sit on the bench. And I finally got to the point that I was done. I had to do something. So all of a sudden, and this wasn't me, I fell on my knees facing the lake and yelled out, "God, I need you." I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about that moment. And just then, a very cool breeze came across the lake. I could see ripples on the water. And that breeze was strong enough to knock me off my knees. And I felt a very strong presence within me say, "I've got you." And then it was gone. It was hot again. But I felt like I had accomplished something there. So I told Father Patrick about it. I said, "This is what happened." He says, "You just experienced the Holy Spirit." And he says, "I'm a Catholic and I'm not supposed to believe in that." But he says, you just had an encounter with the Holy Spirit. And if you feel like he's got you, then he does. And the next 4 months I spent there were delving into my psyche. There was all this shame that I still had buried way down deep inside me. They brought in a top-notch psychiatrist to hypnotize me, and he did. And that was not only the best but the worst point in my whole life, because I got all my whole past flooding out of me on videotape, and I had no idea all that hurt was still in there, and it was. Well, they hypnotized me 2 more times after that, and after I had spilled my guts, and I was a whole different person. I mean, I wept for 3 hours after the first time I watched that videotape. Second time I wept another 2 or 3 hours. I was almost catatonic on the floor. I couldn't do anything. And but once again, I felt that spirit with me that kept telling me, you're going to be okay. Don't lose sight of me. You're going to be okay. And so the night came that I got to leave. I chartered a plane home to Indiana to my wife, who was having a welcome home party for me. Wrong welcome home, though. She had piles of drugs on all the tables and liquor flowing everywhere to welcome her alcoholic son home for rehab. I turned around, walked out, went back to the airport, hired that same plane to take me back to California. And from there, I decided what I was going to do. And one of the first things I was going to have to do was divorce her, because she was not willing to leave that life behind. And so that's my story. And that was 20.11 years ago, 241.33 months ago, 7,347 days ago, and 176,323 hours ago that I've been sober. And the biggest part of my recovery now, I don't go to AA much anymore. I do when I have a friend or somebody that I know needs AA. But the biggest part of my recovery right now is my wife and my God. And if you are in the throes of any kind of addiction, honesty has to be the center point of your entire life. And when we first got married, I'd wake up in the morning and tell her I was an alcoholic again and again and again and again, because I had to keep saying that. There's so many times that I forgot about that. So it was that part of honesty that just had to lead me and keep leading me, and I still do that in my own ways. Praying is one thing, and my Lord keeps reminding me that I'm still flawed. I still need to be working on myself, but now it's a good work. And if any of you have ever been through the 12 steps, and I'm not going to ask if anybody in here has been through the 12 steps, but there's the last step is carrying this message to alcoholics, active alcoholics and addicts still out. And I try to do that as much as I can. And I try to never turn down a phone call from somebody who just even needs to tell me their story, because telling the story helps everybody. And we can no longer let sobriety be in the shadows. We've got to normalize sobriety. And there's nobody in this room, it's like cancer, nobody in this room can swing a dead cat without hitting some family that's been having to deal with alcoholism or drug addiction and all the pain that goes along with it. And it's a disease, folks. It's nothing that you have a choice over after you get into it. And anyway, I will get through this until my Maker calls me home. And I'm as excited as I can be to be here tonight. And if any of you have any questions for me, I'm more than happy to answer them.